And so I think that's really the specific challenge I see the opportunity for the church to address in 2021 is how do we leverage these really kind of quiet moments of community between a very small group of people, even smaller than a small group of people? How do we facilitate those things, knowing that that is often where God works, is in these really kind of small conversations?
Hey, Kingdom One fam, thanks for stopping by for another podcast. Today, we are continuing the conversation we started on the last podcast around our 2021 predictions. We're talking with our executive leadership team, and we're going to be helping you think about ways to create digital spaces for your congregants to feel seen, known, and heard. Also, we're going to be talking about accountability and why it's so important that connection stays at the heart of everything that we do. Let's jump into today's podcast.
Welcome to the Kingdom One podcast, where we grow the church together. This podcast is here to give you big ideas and help you get practical with the tactical.
Hey, Matt. So, what are some of your thoughts around predictions that you have for 2021, specifically in the online digital space?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. So last week when Kendra and Stephen were sharing about what work looks like, that's great for the workplace, for the church leader that's trying to figure out, do I have to have my staff show up or not? What's interesting though is that every person in your church family is going to be presented those similar options, and their workplaces may have a different conclusion than what you do as a church leader when it comes to leading your staff. And so philosophically, it's important to embrace these challenges, because it's going to determine the way that you're able to even access shepherding opportunities with the people in your church. And so one option, I guess, is to allow a mass exodus to happen and then hope that new people choose to move into your region, or it's to begin wrestling with this idea of how does online ministry work? How does it continue to speak into the lives of the people that were connected to your church, that were a part of your church family? There's a concept that's been, I love citing articles that are prior to COVID, because I think we sort of have this COVID bias of, it's just breaking everything and we'll go back to normal, even as Stephen had mentioned last week. The reality though, is that so many of these behaviors existed, they were already being seen prior to this. And so there's an article, Sarah Wilson is the gal's name who wrote it, and it was released February 5th, 2020. So we weren't shut down. We weren't in the throes of, how do we digitize what we do? Everything was normative in the United States at that time. And really what the article's talking about is this idea of bonfires versus campfires. And so what we're seeing in the social media space is the behavior of people wanting smaller groups that are more intimate and more meaningful connection. I know for me, when I watched the Super Bowl, I was watching it, but I was focused on a smaller group of people via text message or WhatsApp or whatever we were using. And we were making comments about whatever we wanted to make comments about. So I had this little micro community. And so the terminology here that I think is so helpful is I had a campfire. I had this small group of people with me that were, across the country, but we were all kind of, watch partying this game together and making comments to one another. And it was a very meaningful experience in a lot of ways, because we shared something together. And so I think for the church, a big transition I think that's going to have to happen and will naturally happen is that we're going to have to figure out what campfires look like. I think we've become, over the last maybe decade or so, we've become very focused on the bonfire. And what, if you've ever been to a bonfire, my dad was inducted into the Baylor Hall of Fame for track many years ago. And, we went to a bonfire and everything was on fire. It was this huge fire in the middle of this field. I couldn't talk to people because it was too loud. All these guys were, screaming ahead of their homecoming game. And, it wasn't a very intimate moment. It wasn't a moment where you could kind of grow deeper alongside people. It was a big party, a big celebration, but that's kind of what our weekends have become. They've become the big party, the big celebration, but we're really working toward creating this affinity between congregant and church, but we're not really helping congregant to congregant And so body of Christ, connecting to each other. And so these campfires really, this kind of concept of campfires really does exist to push us toward how do we facilitate meaningful relationships. And this is the part that I think is critical, maybe that aren't as controlled by us as the church. Maybe we become catalysts to these meaningful relationships. The potluck is still good, but maybe the program isn't like the core hinge of all of our ministries. I haven't heard anybody complaining about missing church programming. I've heard people complaining about missing relationships. And so the digital space really gives us an opportunity to facilitate that. I mean, you look at online games, you look at things like Discord, you even look at these little communities. I mean, some of them are large, but you look at these little kind of communities that pop up on YouTube around whatever it is. I'm a big fan of Bitcoin Twitter. I largely hate Twitter, but Bitcoin Twitter is like the best place in the world. And what it is it's this like silly alignment of values for me with other people that think similarly. And now we can create this really kind of pocket of community within a larger space. And so I think that's really the specific challenge I see the opportunity for the church to address in 2021 is how do we leverage these really kind of quiet moments of community between a very small group of people, even smaller than a small group of people? How do we facilitate those things, knowing that that is often where God works, is in these really kind of small conversations?
Absolutely. I think you hit it right on the head, is digital campfires are where it's going to be. And I think you see that in WhatsApp, you see that, across, even text messaging, just, the conversations that we have offline, that are still very, very digital is really, really important.
Yeah. And what I'm seeing at least is that these aren't movements away. Like this isn't like Facebook's dead now, but what it is it's now a spin up of an additive. It's something different, something additional. And you see that with a lot of the smart companies. Instagram for me is really actually a direct messaging tool. Yes, there's pictures and, videos and all these things, but it's shareability. Like if I can't send that to a small group of people, I'm not nearly as engaged. And so for me personally, that's where Snapchat isn't very compelling because it's not as social for the group of people that I spend time with. And so I've actually jumped onto platforms specifically because that's where my, mini tribe or my campfire, that's where these people are. And so I think that's the type of thing that we're going to see almost unconventional adoption of things like text messages. I haven't heard an announcement that says, hey, welcome to this church. Have you texted your friends today? It's like, it's weird. It doesn't feel as formal as we want. We want a destination. We want it to be branded by us. We want it to be, part of our ecosystem. The reality is that some people use WhatsApp, some people use Signal, some people use, text messaging. Some people, there's all sorts of methodologies for communication and for community building. And I think that's where we maybe need to let go a little bit and say, we're not going to govern how you be in community, but we are going to facilitate it and we're going to push you real hard toward it.
That's so good. I believe the church should be a place that facilitates that community. It's so good. John, can you let us know, what is your prediction for 2021 from your perspective?
So hard to predict still what's happening, what's going to happen economically speaking. I think we're still, depending on the market, depending on the culture of the community around, it's a little bit hard to financially predict. I think if we're aware of what's happening right now around us, we're going to start seeing some things the church needs to start moving towards. If you've been following the news in the last 2 weeks, here we are mid-February, stories of moral failure in the church, or of our heroes of the church, as well as economic scrutiny of the church and how resources are being spent, is starting to hit the news. And all of that's unfortunately it's an embarrassment to the church. It's an embarrassment to Christianity. But what I think that the outside world is going to start looking to the church is for increased accountability, increased transparency. The fear for the church's regulation that could come with that. There's already so many requirements for the organizations, religious or not, outside of the church, that they have to be transparent. They have to meet certain standards socially, with how they steward their resources, how they disclose that to the general public. The church, by God's grace, has been protected from some of that. I believe that's one of the greatest assets of the church. And the Big C church needs to protect that freedom. I think we have a regulatory world where, while attacks may be coming from the whether it be from the political front, the legislator, or the executive branch, right now we have a judicial branch that has protected and preserved those freedoms over the last several years, whether it be through ministers' housing, the reinforcement of religious liberties, things like that, and then how that protects the church. But what that means, what I would see that the church needs to start being mindful of, is getting good at finance, getting good at what they do, and on the day-to-day basis. I think it's very easy for a church to, and rightfully so, and it's not just churches, it's any ministry organization, putting the effort towards the mission. And it is missions first. It's the most important thing. But unfortunately, things that get neglected are the day-to-days, the finances, pulling in a volunteer or somebody maybe not especially skilled in those areas, that can create, without a better word, a mess for them. And so I think in COVID land, where we've been the last several months, everybody's had their radar up a little bit more. Hey, how are we doing financially? What is going on? Maybe there's some churches that are asking a lot more questions than they have in years past, because when, you can make hay when the sun shines, but when the sun stops shining, we look at the finance. That's the first thing that we start asking ourselves about. So I think there's been a lot of introspection in the last several months. I think there's an opportunity going forward for the church, like we were talking about earlier in our recording, is that we need to not be lagging behind the marketplace. If anything, we are stewarding the kingdom resources of the church, and these things are so precious and so valuable. It is part of our witness to steward them well. So we need to get sharp. We need to improve and be the best, I believe, compared to the marketplace, in how we. And I hate to, just without a better word, doing our accounting. But so much comes from that, and getting the right tools and people involved to steward those things well. I think, unfortunately, again, how does regulation, what regulation could come that could force us to have to be transparent in those areas? We should be preparing now, should that happen. Should a regulator show up on our door, we have a clean house, we have clean records. Those are already done. Let's look to the marketplace to how they do it. We should be following all those rules, because just because we're exempt organizations and free from public disclosure doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing those things. They're required anyways. But in order to do that well, we may need to make sure we have a handful of things in order. That's the right tools, the right people. An accounting department is not just a bookkeeper. There's layers of accounting, and they're all important, whether it be the people actually recording those transactions, your bookkeeper, your controller, or your accounting finance manager, and then the CFO, finance director, person above that. They all serve different purposes, and when you commingle them together, it's like a three-legged stool. You start pulling one of those legs of the stool out, the whole thing gets wobbly. So it's important to make sure you have access to those resources. And unfortunately, that's a tough thing to do as a smaller church, most of those in the country being under 200. But there are resources out there. There are opportunities to plug into other parachurch ministries, other professionals. Small plug for Kingdom One. I mean, that's what we're here to do. But that's how do we bring, and I think the finance leaders, us, on our side, have to figure out how to get those resources out to the church. We need to make ourselves accessible, and we haven't done that very well. So if we as CPAs, we as finance professionals can be accessible for those churches to help work with them, especially those of us with not-for-profit training, because it's a whole different animal. That we just need that partnership is going to be so important, so that we can help the church be strong financially, carry it into the next season of what comes out of all these transformations and evolutions we're going through, and make the church stronger for the next generation ahead. It's going to be a gnarly world for the church in the next 4 to 8 years. If we start thinking what could come out of Congress from the Equality Act, attacks on religious liberty, we need to just keep our antenna up and be preparing now.
That's so good. Stephen, did you have something you wanted to say to that?
Yeah, can I tag on real quickly, John? I think that's so good, and I think we all as believers, like we understand, and we're told, really this is part of what being a believer is to seek out accountability, right? Why do we do that? We do that so we can protect our witness. We do that so we can point people to Christ. We do that because we have an enemy that wants us specifically to stumble and to fall. And like we talked about last week, Nick, living in a digital era, when a very high profile leader stumbles and falls, the reputation of the capital C church is really put, again, at risk, so much more so than maybe it ever has been, right? Because it hits a headline, it hits a website, and really the whole world watches. And so some might feel like, well, at my local church, we're so buried in the vastness of the world that, if we're not pursuing all those correct steps, it's not really going to make that big of a difference. But frankly, it does. And so, John, it's so good what you said. We as believers, and then we ultimately then as local, churches, as the body of Christ, sort of expressed, kind of across the world, across, the U.S. as we reach our local communities. If we feel like somehow we're above needing accountability, if we feel like we don't need to put the same level of rigor because we don't have regulators breathing down our neck, they will become our accountability. And they're not doing it because they're interested in our mission. They're doing it because we've made enough mistakes that we need to be policed by them more so, right? And so how can we as a church, again, lead the way versus kind of needing to have, sort of big brother come in, so to speak, and how can we model, again, for the marketplace what really healthy accountability looks like, And so, again, I appreciate what you said, John. That's just kind of a quick, sort of another thing to tag on to that.
That's so good. That's so good. As we wrap this up, I want to give you my prediction for the digital space. And I think that one of the biggest things that has changed in the digital space for churches has been how we operate. I've been tracking with Transformation Church and Mike Todd, and he has a series called Anchored. And Anchored is kind of like what I would consider an Easter series. It's like just that level of production. And the amount that he's invested in online, in the digital space and social media has just been something that only other digital media companies have actually been able to do as well. And so I think there's a big shift that's happening. And I think three things from that big shift can be done for local small churches in order to match that kind of shift. And first is big and bold moves are going to get attention, but it's connection that is going to keep people staying. And what I mean by that is that, we can put a lot of energy into our production. We can put a lot of energy into the content that we create, but it's people who are warm, caring, compassionate, and who will remember and listen. That's what's going to be the thing that keeps people. If you want to find out like what I'm talking about when I talk about big, bold moves, if you go to transformationchurch.us/anchored, that is such a great series to see how you can add value in production. The second thing I'm seeing is that felt needs are missed, and that's the biggest opportunity. And what I mean by that is when it comes to, I think a lot of times as a church, we try to solve things in conferences. We try to make things really big. I think the day-to-day content creation around felt needs, around kids, around health, around just the things that we need in 2020 and 2021. What do we need in this pandemic time? We need connection, and we need hope, and we need people to speak to our marriage. And so I think, conferences, great, fantastic. But the day-to-day is where we're going to win that battle. And then finally, the third thing I think that a small church can do to make that big shift is going to be having an anywhere strategy. Like, how can your church be had anywhere? As we talked in our first podcast about the globalization of the church and the influence that we have, I think that having a strategy for anywhere with a group of people, whether that's a family, how can they experience the church service in a unique and participatory way, not just a viewing way, but participatory, I think is going to be really, really huge. Those are my three predictions for 2021 and beyond. Team, I want to thank you so much for hanging out today and for just all the wisdom that you shared. Stephen, what is the best way a church leader can get in touch with Kingdom One?
Yeah, I think probably the best way is you can find us online at kingdomone.co. From there, you can easily reach out to our team and even just articulate to us, what are some things that are keeping you up at night, right? We all have those things that sit on our desk that stare at us every day that we're just like, I don't know how to solve this. And so maybe they gather dust, but they prevent us from getting good sleep or good rest or cause us stress. And so find us there. You can also, again, find us on the interwebs, right? And so whether you connect with us on LinkedIn or catch us in our various social areas, we would love to meet you. We'd love to interact with you, and let's grow the church together. Right? That is our battle cry here at Kingdom One, and so hopefully you can even see and you're listening to just the depth of competence that even, I'm humbled by the folks I'm even just sharing this call with, who all love the Lord with a deep passion, and would love to come alongside your ministry and help you where you're at. And so we're a judgment-free group. We just love to come alongside and to help. And so we'd love to chat with you soon.
Kingdom One family, thank you for stopping by for another podcast. And I just want to let you know, every time I hear from the executive leadership team at Kingdom One, I get so excited. There are 3 C's that we live by here at Kingdom One. One is collaboration. We know that when it comes to growing the church, you need somebody in your corner who is a personal advocate for your mission and your vision of the church. The second thing that we constantly talk about is competencies. We are constantly learning that it is so important to stay ahead of the curve, to understand what new regulations may be coming or changes to technology that might take place so your church is never in a deficit. And finally, one of the most important things for us is constructive feedback, for us to help you and for you to help us grow the church together. And that means that we have to give feedback that is going to grow us, that we have to not be in a vacuum when it comes to decision making, but we understand that it's through process of people who have competency and who are collaborative that we grow with that constructive feedback. If you have any questions for me, you can hit me up directly at nick@kingdom1.co, or if you want to get started today with services, you can go to kingdom1.co/services. Thanks for tuning in, and until we chat again, let's grow the church together.